The book begins with an introductory chapter that really walks through the student of the critical issues that are related to the synoptic problem. So the key terms, the key figures, and it kind of presents a history that places our discussion within the larger context of how the church has talked about these issues for 2,000 years. And so the first view is presented by Craig Evans, an internationally known Jesus scholar at Houston Baptist University, and he presents what is now probably the view that's held by the most New Testament scholars, and that's the two-source hypothesis, which argues that Mark was written first, followed by Matthew and then Luke, which also shared a separate source, which they call Q. The next view is the Farrer hypothesis, which is presented by Mark Coeditor of Duke University, who's become kind of the leading proponent of this view, which is similar to the first, that Mark wrote first, followed by Matthew and Luke, but dispenses with that unknown source Q and says that Luke had direct access to Matthew's gospel. The third hypothesis is the two-gospel hypothesis, and that's presented by David Peabody of Nebraska Wesleyan University, who was a student of William Farmer's, who really articulated this view that Matthew's gospel was actually the first to be written, followed by Luke, and that Mark's gospel is really a combination of the first two. He essentially conflated the first two gospels and presented a shorter and more succinct gospel. These three views are followed by Rainer Resner, a German scholar, who presents a view which really emphasizes the oral and the eyewitness testimony as a way of explaining the relationship between the Synoptic Gospels. So he wouldn't deny that there might be some kind of literary relationship, but he argues, based upon what we know about oral culture, about transmission of early gospel stories, that helps us explain these similarities and these differences better than these more simple literary hypotheses. And so these four, which we think are kind of the best representations of these hypotheses, they each present an essay which clearly articulates their view, and then they've read each other's essays afterwards, and then they write a following essay which engages with the three other scholars. And so we have this dialogue that goes throughout the book. In the last chapter, Stan Porter and I take the discussion that's just been presented and clearly summarize some of the key features, try to draw some parallels and some contrasts between the four views that have been presented, and then we articulate some questions for the student going forth. So what questions remain at the end of this discussion, and what can students take away from this discussion as they begin to read the Gospels for themselves and think through these questions individually? Our hope is that by the end of the book, students have been given a useful tool for navigating the critical issues of reading the Synoptic Gospels in the Gospels course, and that the book presents a state of play of the current discussion happening around the synoptic problem. And our hope is that as students begin to read the Gospels closely in a course like this, that they've been given the terminology and some of the best thinking on how to explain the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke that arises in a close reading in a Gospels course.